accordance with the verdict that the jury has rendered, this court hereby sentences you to 90 years in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice and a $10,000 fine as imposed by the jury.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear the thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. During the sentencing hearing, when Mo's mother read out her victim impact statement, she said if Kaitlin had just met Mo face to face, woman to woman, all of this could have been avoided.
It was cowardly because he never chose to face her woman to woman in a civil conversation. She would have listened.
Well, that did actually happen. They did come face to face, and we get a much deeper sense of the actual relationship dynamic going on by drilling into a single incident. And we're going to deal with the one that played out in Bentonville as related by Outside Online's Ian Dill. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. I'll still be continuing with a couple more episodes on this case. I do want to alert those. I've looked at my audience stats for the video titled Dominatrix. That is a video, it's a very important video that deals with what happened after the incident and just the fact that I actually don't know if it is definitely a fact. It's certainly a story that apparently Kaitlin initiated sex, quite sort of dominant, forceful, rough sex with Colin on the night of the incident, after the incident. And I dealt with that in the video Dominatrix. And I see from my stats that the average view duration was 11 minutes, and only brought up that particular aspect. That was what that video was all about in the second half of that video. So if you missed it, if you only listened to halfway, you might want to go back to that video and watch the second half. In terms of this video, where we are going to further explore the deeper dynamic, instead of having just a very superficial sense of what is going on, we're going to get a much deeper dynamic, a deeper sense of the relationship dynamic than certainly was explored in court or in any other narrative. So if you finding this insightful, interesting, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So I'm quoting from the excellent article by Outside Online's Ian Dill. I'll put a link to that in the description. He writes, quote, "At the end of January 2022, Armstrong and Strickland went back to Bentonville to attend the nearby Cyclocross World Championships. Strickland had some sponsor events to go to. Armstrong, who had reconsidered her involvement with Wheelhouse Mobile, in other words, she'd previously said that she was not going to continue helping him with his business. She'd now changed her mind and decided she would still be on board. Well, she came to participate in a business meeting for their company. She also went because she loves bikes. Kaitlin also liked bikes. She was stoked, and according to the article, she was stoked about watching these races and seeing her friends in the cycling community. At the time, this is really important, Colin Strickland still considered himself single. Very important. In January 2022, he thought of himself as single. And even though, to some extent, he'd reconciled with Armstrong, and he was no longer with Mo Wilson, he basically was conducting himself as though he was, I guess, single. And so, essentially, he was in relationship limbo, in the words of the article, trying to figure out if he even wanted a life partner. That was where he was in January. The murder happened 4 or 5 short months later. And so when friends asked about Armstrong, what is going on are you with her or aren't you? Strickland would firmly say, we are not together. And so that was kind of the sword of Damocles that was hanging over her, that Strickland was finding reasons and excuses to not be in a relationship with her, even though they were in a business relationship and even though they were living together. Now, consider that he lives in a house with his business partner and off and on romantic partner. And doesn't that suggest that he wants the best of both worlds? When it suits him, he's with her. When it doesn't, he isn't. Going back to the article, quote, Wilson, of course, was in Bentonville too. Remember, this is for the World Cyclocross Championships. And she and Strickland shared a few sponsors. And so she found herself at the same events as Strickland and Armstrong. And so, again, think about Karen's words saying, if you'd only met her face to face, well, they had. And so the situation, according to the article, was awkward for everyone. At one point, all three, get this, all three of them, Colin, Mo, Kaitlin, all three of them were seated together at the same dinner. It wasn't like a long table where Mo was at one end and Kaitlin was at the other, and they were literally sitting side by side. Strickland was in the middle, Armstrong and Wilson were on either side. They could hear what one another was saying. If they wanted to, they could have said something to one another. Mo could have said something to Kaitlin. Kaitlin could have said something to Mo. Colin could have said something to both of them. And so one of the friends apparently joked at this event, what, does he have a hand on each thigh? And that is exactly what the problem was. That there's a saying, never a truer word spoken in jest. Well, that was exactly the problem. That was what Armstrong was thinking. That is in a way also what Mo was thinking. And the issue was, well, what is Colin thinking? What does Colin want? Is he going to say what he wants? Does he even know what he wants? In a situation such as this, Mo's mere presence and stature as a force, a real force in women's cycling, and she certainly was in January 2022, was that she would be fatally undermining to Kaitlin. Her presence there would basically show that in terms of status in a cycling scenario, a cycling situation, she was more important essentially than Kaitlin. At a major cycling event such as this, any non-pro cyclist would feel merely human. And Kaitlin herself relegated to a mere business partner, basically a loser in this social setting, with Mo advancing up the status quo in the eyes of Colin and the cycling community and most of the people in that situation. Returning to the article, quote, through their jobs as professional cyclists, Strickland and Wilson often saw each other at races like this during the spring season and at post-race parties. In March of 2022, after they finished the Mid-South gravel race in Stillwater, Oklahoma, they got together at a bar with a group of riders and industry pros, drinking beer until midnight. At some point, they heard that the race's last finishers were coming in. Strickland, Wilson, and pro rider Pete Stetina hustled over to the finish line to cheer them in. Now, you get a sense here that the vortices of cycling were strong and that cycling's gravity for its heads of state would continue bringing them together, bringing them closer and closer, shoulder to shoulder. And when it did, it would be in the giddy environment of podiums, cheering crowds, warm and fuzzy parties, and validating prize money. And this was the inner sanctum that Kaitlin would forever struggle to be part of. And was she a part of that on that night? She would struggle to be part of that, let alone penetrate it. And I do think she wanted to be part of it. I do think she wanted to feel special. Who wouldn't? Going back to the article, quote, Wilson, who'd placed second at Mid-South, would later recount, celebrating the moment in a newsletter, Mail from Mo. She would write about the last female finisher, and she said, it was dark, it was cold, and she had been out there for 14.5 hours. That's this last female finisher. 14.5 hours, that is longer than some people take to do the Ironman. I mean, I did the Ironman in about 2 hours less than that. So that's what she's saying in this newsletter. What an incredible display of strength and perseverance. watching this woman cross the line with dozens of others cheering her on was a special moment. This is why we ride. We ride to do hard things and celebrate those things together. And obviously Kaitlin wants to do that as well. Also ride, also do hard things, also celebrate with these people that she respects and enjoys and likes and loves. Now, if you think about Kaitlin's motive, it was to preserve her own fairy tale with Colin. Colin may not have thought of it as a fairy tale. He may not have thought as Kaitlin as being part of any fairy tale. But he wasn't on the outside looking in. If you think about it, it really made no sense for Kaitlin to kill Colin. I mean, he was the one cheating on her. He was the one that she trusted. But it made no sense to kill him because Colin was her fairy tale. Mo was the threat to her fairy tale, even as far as affecting in which room she slept in her own home. Going back to the article and the touching moment welcoming back the back markers, quote, to Stetina the moment felt collegial. There wasn't any romantic vibe or hand-holding or anything like that, he says. It was just some friends having drinks. But other racers who saw them felt differently. Who wasn't there? A guy called Tolly says. Well, Kaitlin wasn't there. Where's Colin? Well, right next to Mariah the whole time. And this, again, is the crucial insight. If you were part of this inner circle, this elite group, it may not necessarily have seemed like a big deal. But if you weren't part of it and you wanted to be, it would have a whole different level of tension and insufficiency attached to it. And if you think about those feelings, especially when you in your 20s and 30s, those feelings of belonging and inadequacy and insecurity can feel like a life and death struggle. It can feel extremely painful when you are getting signals that aren't basically fulfilling and adding up to the fairy tale that you've got for yourself, this dream that you think that you're part of. And that then brings us to another dimension you never really hear about in this case, which is substance abuse. Substance abuse in the early fabric of Armstrong's formative years. And this is why clean living Colin was so attractive to her. Now see, we're now at 12 minutes into this video. This seems to be the point where people's attention spans fray and then just stop listening. And yet this is such an important insight into Kaitlin. Why is she so attracted to Colin? Well, because she came from a home where there was unhealthy substance abuse. Let's just say it's unclean living, unhealthy living. And yes, she's with someone who's not just someone who eats clean and lives a healthy life, but he's super healthy. He's super strong. He's in a way a superstar because of his clean living habits, because of his discipline. And she loves that. That really, really resonates with her, but it resonates so much more because of this kind of diseased, if you think of drinking as a kind of disease, this diseased background that she was trying to leave behind her. According to the article, Tolly told me, that's the writer of the article, that both he and Armstrong grew up in homes with an alcoholic parent. Now, I'm not quite sure whether the he there refers to Tolly or Colin. I just do not know the answer to that. I'm assuming it means Tolly. Anyway, he says, when you're raised like that, your self-esteem is super low and you can be much more forgiving of rocky relationships. And so the converse of that is if your self-esteem is strong and high and good, you've got high self-esteem, then you're less forgiving of rocky relationships and you want higher standards in the people around you for yourself. And so someone who's on again, off again, someone who's in a relationship limbo, someone who can't decide, you're going to leave them by the wayside and find someone who appreciates you. And so that is one really important explanation for why this particular person shot another person twice in the head, once to the heart, and then threw a bicycle away, was because she was suffering from very low self-esteem. And I do think in a weird sense, Mo was as well. Mo could also see that Colin wasn't kind of the best partner for her. He was much older, and he was in a very tricky relationship. She was aware of that. And also from Colin's perspective, I think he could have also seen that it was going to be difficult to see Mo when he was living with Kaitlin, and he also lived with his own mother for 6 months of the year. You can kind of see that all three of them, in a way, have kind of self-esteem issues. I would say in Mo's case, just because she's kind of quite young and she's new to this whole thing, she's finding her feet. I wouldn't say that she's not a confident person per se, but just in a relationship sense, she's trying to find her feet in terms of self-esteem. And so I do think self-esteem in this entire love triangle was what kept the love triangle going. If you could repair one person's self-esteem in the story, one of the three, then you wouldn't have the love triangle. Anyway, going back to the article, Tolly was aware that Strickland could seem cold, often referring to Armstrong as his friend rather than his girlfriend. Close acquaintances would say something like, look, if you're not into her, if you're not into Kaitlin, let her go. You guys are in your mid-30s, and you know what? She's ready to settle down. You know, you kind of owe it to her to be transparent, to be honest, to tell her what you're feeling. And they'd kind of say as well, you know, it's too late, Colin, to screw around like this. You need to be honest with her.
You know, I mean, I don't want her to go. Yeah. I've been hanging out at her place a lot.
Oh, wait. That's right there. That's bullshit. You got to be fair to her.
And so in January, when Strickland and Armstrong came back from Bentonville in the fall of 2021 and broke up, it seemed likely that both of them would move on. And so it seems like they did have a talk, but then it seemed also like someone went back down the path of least resistance, and there wasn't enough discipline to keep up with what had been decided previously. And, you know, one way to break up is someone to leave the same building and go and stay somewhere else. That's typically what happens when there are breakups. You don't typically live with your girlfriend when you've broken up with her. And I think that is a big part of the problem in this story. I do think what Colin and Mo did was actually screw around, even if technically they weren't. Right? So they were screwing around, but they technically weren't actually, you know, having sex. But it was screwing around in terms of what was going on. What they weren't counting on, as I say, was the existential tension that was ratcheting up. And why was it ratcheting up? Well, because of the sound of a clock ticking. Why is Kaitlin ready to settle down? Well, it's because of this clock that's ticking. She's entering that final phase, the last 5 years of her life, when she can safely bear children. For her, it's now or never with Colin. And then Mo comes along. And it's still that. It's Caitlin's now or never. It's her moment. And because Colin's not saying to her in an absolute way, maybe he does say it, but then they kind of sort of fall back. You know, it's on and off, and it's not absolutely clear. And so this is her moment, and she feels she just can't let Mo keep coming back, almost like an emotional intruder. Someone who effortlessly breaks into her life, breaks down the house of cards that Kaitlin has taken a lifetime to put together. And, you know, I do think, and I'm certainly not taking Caitlin's side in this, but I do think if you were wondering whether Kaitlin was feeling sorry for Mo, if you were wondering whether Kaitlin regretted what she did to Mo, if Kaitlin looked at the autopsy photos, she probably thought, well, you know what? You killed me 1,000 times. You know how painful it was, all of those stabs to the heart. And so what Kaitlin did, you know, for her, she'd taken a lifetime to put together her life, and Colin was kind of the Christmas tree at the end of it. Colin was the cherry at the top of this thing that she'd built. She'd not just built it, but built it despite the wreckage of her upbringing and her parents' divorce. And that's what made it so hard fought for. And the alcoholism that was part of that unhappy chapter was also something that she'd come such a long way from, or had she? In any event, this was Kaitlin's shot at a happily ever after. And that is why it was so important that Colin have the talk with her in a very clear way so that she would know where she stood with him. And then if he has this talk, back that up with action as well.
She loves you. If you don't love her, you've got to tell her.
Going back to the article, and this is also going back to the events of the day, basically the morning of the day that Mo Wilson was shot. After she got back from riding, Kaitlin Armstrong texted Colin Strickland to let him know that she'd gotten an email from a lawyer. And what was all of this about? Well, there was another source of stress in Strickland and Armstrong's relationship. They were in the middle of litigation over commercial property. This is another thing. If there were all of these forces bringing the cyclists together, this was a kind of a string that was tying Colin and Kaitlin together. This litigation over commercial property. And guess what? Armstrong was a realtor, and they were both speculating on the property markets. And so there's a commercial property in Lockhart that Strickland had intended to use as a warehouse for Wheelhouse Mobile. And of course, Armstrong was involved in that, managing that business. And so he claimed that the realtor had tried to sell it to a friend right before he was set to close. So he'd hired a lawyer in an effort to close the contract and acquire the property. And so this is where his thoughts and his heart and his mind was, right? And what this did, it set stress levels at a much higher point than they would otherwise have been, just as Christmas in the Ramsey home created particular and peculiar levels of stress amongst the family and especially amongst the children that weren't otherwise there. And bear in mind, this also played out during COVID, and so there was the stress, that long period of stress that was undermining these people as well, in the sense that they were forced to live together to some extent. It was an artificial situation. There was not as much racing going on. And then kind of at the end of that period, Mo swoops into town, and I think she represented a kind of stress relief for Colin, right? And I think it was a kind of stress relief for Mo as well to see Colin. But it was the absolute opposite for Kaitlin. It set the stress level for her into radioactive critical. She's already in like a defense mode in terms of this litigation, and now someone is coming along that's totally distracting her partner, her business partner. And so Colin was in that limbo where he didn't really want to deal with things, and Kaitlin was in a limbo where someone important to her didn't want to deal with things either. And then with no response and some limbo time on her hands, this is on the day, that fateful day, May 11th, Kaitlin turned on Colin's laptop and found out why there was this limbo, found out where this limbo was coming from, found out who was redirecting his thoughts to herself and away from Kaitlin. And by doing that, this was weakening her, defeating her, and undermining whatever resolve Colin still might have had to settle down with her. And so it was within this fabric that alarm bells weren't just going off, but clanging. It's interesting that Kaitlin returned from the murder carrying a yoga mat and wearing yoga clothes. She could probably have done with a yoga session that day and that night in order to sort of cool off, in order just to reach a position of physical and mental calmness. But what did she do instead? She decided on something altogether more practical and more lethal. When she opened the drawer, the Sig Sauer gleamed at her, and all she had to do was point and pull the trigger. Problem solved. It's now or never. And so she did. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.